Welcome to our Bible study. We are in week 38 and we're finally finishing chapter 11, which means we only have one last section of the book to go. The context of today, making sure that we're back in that train of thought, as we've wrapped up answering the question, is God done with Israel? And if so, how do they fit into this whole Jesus family thing? And we looked at there is a remnant, that there is this part of Israel that is faithful through grace. It's no longer the remnant that's just faithful through works, through keeping the law, through trying to be obedient the way it has been through like the times of the exile, but instead they've been faithful through grace, through the mercy of Jesus. And so Paul himself considered himself part of that remnant, and through that remnant more and more of Israel will come to salvation, will come to know Jesus, will come to accept him as the king and savior that he is. But until any part of Israel does that, well, they're not in. Just because they're born of the ethnic Israelite group doesn't make them part of God's people, right? And it doesn't mean that God doesn't love them either. Even though they're on the outside, they are enemies, as we looked at last week. That if they do not have faith in Jesus, they are his enemies, but he loves them. Like they are special to him, but without Jesus, there's no salvation. There is no being part of God's people. They are not part of the tree, as Paul used a couple weeks back, looking at the olive tree metaphor. That they're not part of that tree, that family tree that is God's people. You have to have Jesus. There's no getting around that. And God uses their rejection of his son, of Jesus, as a means to save the world, and which in turns is a means to save them. That because the Israelites rejected Jesus, well, that opened the door for the Gentiles to come in, because otherwise it would have just seemed like the God of Israel was saving his own people. And they would have never invited the outsiders in the way God had planned to all along. So because Israel rejected Jesus, the Gentiles were brought in. And then because the Gentiles were brought in, well, the Israelites are getting jealous that these Gentiles, these people who weren't looking for God's mercy, God's grace, are now getting to enjoy it. And so they are getting jealous and jumping into the family tree. It's complicated, it's messy, but as we finished out with last week, it's the only way that works. We finished last week with verse 32 of chapter 11, which kind of summarizes this whole section, chapters 9 through 11. It says, "For God has shut up all people in disobedience, so that he may have mercy upon all." That because of Israel's rejection, disobedience, the Gentiles are now being welcomed in as part of his people. And because of the Gentiles' disobedience, and because of their in turn obedience, the Israelites are being brought in. So it's God had shut up all people. He had kept people away because they're enemies with him, but in turn, he did this so that he can have mercy upon all. It's complicated, it's messy, but it's the only way. And that gets us to today's section, the very last part of chapter 11, which is kind of a response, right? All the theological ideas, all the doctrine stuff, Paul's worked all that out now. We are at the solution. Now, this is Paul's response. So he says, starting in verse 33, "Oh, the depths of the riches and the wisdom and knowledge of God. We cannot search his judgments. We cannot fathom his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord? Or who has given him counsel? Who has given a gift to him which needs to be repaid? For from him, through him, and to him are all things. Glory to him forever. Amen." See, growing up, I went to school. I went to a public school, and the public school that I went to, I'm proud of it. I loved my school. I might not have given you that answer growing up, but looking back now, it's like I'm very proud of the school system and the city and the town that I grew up in. I loved it. That's where I grew up. But when I was growing up there, they were notorious for not voting to raise taxes to build new school facilities, right? Like the school buildings that I went into were ancient by modern standards. And it's not that there's anything wrong with old buildings if that's the best thing, right? Like if that's the best decision, hey, let's preserve this beautiful, wonderful piece of history and we can make it awesome. Like that's not what was happening. It was, we have no other options. We got to make this building from 1902 work, right? Like it was a mess. I mean, let's just be real. Like it worked. It produced brilliant people. It produced, people who are successful. It's not that it was a hindrance, but it wasn't the best case scenario. And in some cases, it did cause problems. I mean, this like the buildings where I went to school, like when I joined the seventh grade, there was 7th grade through 12th grade all on one campus, right? And you had high school that was built in like the early 1900s. You had buildings built in the 1950s. Then those were the new buildings, right? Like those were the newest buildings on my high school's campus. So these 1950s era buildings. And it was cramped, it was overcrowded. They did the things where like there used to be a stage where you could have musicals and stuff, but no, they walled that in and cut it up into a couple classrooms. There were a couple closets that had been converted. There was the trailers in the back that were housed the entire English department. It was not the best case scenario. And every time that it was put before the voters to raise money, to increase taxes a little bit so that we could build a new facility for our children, build a new high school, divide up, create a middle school so you don't have 7th graders right there next to seniors in high school, which is not a safe thing. Like, it was always turned down, right? I mean, it literally cost people's lives. Like the schools, the facilities didn't have enough room to provide lunch facilities for the entire school, right? Like there was not enough seating in a cafeteria section. The cafeteria was just the old gym from the building in the 1900s. There was like early 1900s, like 1910. There was no space for that, and so they had to set kids loose on the town every day for lunch, and it resulted in kids dying because they're rushing to get out and rushing to get back. Whereas if they had stayed on campus and ate lunch there, maybe it wouldn't have happened. So like it caused problems. It needed to happen, and it was painful and it was ugly. And vote after vote, it got turned down until a few years after I graduated. Figures, right? But I'm glad it happened. A few years after I graduated, they finally got the levy passed. They raised taxes. They got the architect to design a new building, and they started to build. And I remember, like, because I was still kind of around my hometown at this point, that they had this area right next to the one of the elementary schools that were a little bit out of town, and they had dug out the whole area where this new high school is going to be. They laid the foundations, they poured the concrete foundations. They had this whole property prepped and ready to start erecting buildings. And when you looked at it, you could see where the new sports facilities were going to be. This was going to be where the new gym was. It's going to be this big, great thing instead of the cramped, tiny gym we had been using. This is where the new track facilities are going to be. Our school had a fantastic track program. This is where the parking lots are going to be. So much better parking instead of trying to fill up all these different streets and alleys around the school downtown. There's all these benefits, and you could sit there and you could see it and you could look around and say, this is where this building's going to be. This is where that building's going to be. This is where this facility's going to be. And you could picture in your head immediately and clearly, like, yes, we're building something great here. Finally. After years and years, decades of trying to make this happen, you could stand over that construction site with those foundations poured and see exactly what's going to happen. You couldn't fully picture it. That doesn't happen until the buildings were built, but you could see it, right? You could tell this is going to be something good. And for everybody who had been campaigning for that new school building, everybody who had been working, trying to convince the community that this is something we need, that moment, that was special. That was a moment when they saw what their work was being used for. They could see it almost here, but they knew that the work wasn't done, that they had more work to do to make sure this project was completed. That is what Paul wants us to feel at the end of chapter 11. That feeling of standing there before this giant project. You can see the foundations are poured. You can see where the buildings are going to go. Maybe it'll be slightly different from what you're picturing in your head, but you can get a pretty good idea in your mind. And you just have to stand and celebrate it. The work is started, the foundations are laid, and we can imagine what this project that God has been building is going to look like. The design is complicated. It's something that you and I couldn't sit down and come up with on our own, but it's going to be marvelous when it's complete. And so some may look at Israel and the way God has done things and think God should have done it differently, right? Why did he use broken people to try to fix this? Couldn't he have just done it himself? Couldn't he have just avoided all of the human mistakes and mess and suffering and just made this right from the beginning? It's one of those, it's kind of an almost universal experience when you start to think on these things. Like we look at the pain and the suffering, we look at the heartache, the trials, the blood, the death, the suffering. We look at all the things that go wrong in this world and we think, couldn't have God done it a different way? And Paul recognizes that temptation. He recognizes it, and we know he does because of the verses that he quotes. He quotes largely from the book of Job, and I love the book of Job. It's a weird book to love because it's not a book that gives you a satisfying answer on first glance, right? If you're unfamiliar with the book of Job, it's probably the oldest book in the Bible, actually. But he loses everything, right? He loses it, and there's not a good reason for him to lose it, right? It's almost like God has a bet with the devil, and it's like that the devil could get him to curse God by taking away all of his stuff, and then all of his family, minus a wife who he apparently doesn't get along with because she's cruel to him or something. I don't know. Like, the point is, Job loses everything, and there's not a great reason for it, right? There's no some significant, it saved lives. Like, it's just like, it seems like God just wanted to win a bet. And at the end of losing everything, Job is surrounded by these friends who are trying to tell him, hey, no, you must have done this thing wrong. You must have done that thing wrong. You've done something to make God mad. There's got to be a reason why God did this to you. And Job's accurate in saying, no, I didn't. But then Job crosses the line and says, well, God did something wrong. He says, there's no reason for me to suffer like this. If me and God were on equal footing, man, I would win that court case. And then God shows up at the end. And God says, were you there when I laid the foundations of the world? Were you there when I drew up the plans to build this creation? Were you there when I knit together the cells of the body, when I created the rain cycle and the rock cycle and the solar cycle? Were you there when I started causing the planets to spin? Were you there? Do you understand how all this works? And God explains, not in depth, not satisfyingly, but he just simply points to, listen, I'm God, and I make no mistakes. And that's kind of the way the book ends, right? That's why it's a weird book, because it seems like God is just saying, listen, I'm God, get over it. But in a sense, that's actually the best answer you could get, because God is God. You and I are not God, right? You and I are not on that level. You and I have a perspective that is limited to us. Like, we live life as if it's a movie. We watch it one scene at a time sequentially. God sees the universe as a painting. He sees it all at once, and he can add different colors and strokes and textures wherever, whenever, however he wants, because it's his painting. He understands the bigger picture the way you and I simply can't. Our minds do not work that way. God is the ocean. Our brains are a thimble, a teacup. We can't contain hardly any of the vastness of who God is. God's knowledge and wisdom are so far beyond anything that we can comprehend. Every one of us is going to get to the other side of Judgment Day, and we're going to go before God, and God's going to laugh at us at some of the things that we thought we knew. And that's going to be a universal experience, I think. The point of the book of Job is God is God. He is above us, and that is enough. There is no good reason from our perspective for why Job suffered, for why the bad things happened, for why, but God doesn't make mistakes. And so while we may not understand, we have to trust. That's the point of the book of Job. And Paul, by quoting Job here in this little praise section he has at the end of chapter 11, he is telling us, listen, yes, Israel and the way God has brought about salvation, it was messy, it was complicated. It may not make perfect sense to us, but it is the only way, and God does not make mistakes. That we don't understand the way the universe, the fundamental laws of creation, the way God does. That we don't understand what it takes for God to both be just and merciful, to stand on truth and be unwavering in it, to be a God who has no change, who is irrefutable, unchanging, and perfect, but also be merciful, loving, and kind towards us, his creation. How does he do both? You and I could not come up with a solution, but he did. And it worked out the way it did, through Israel, through Jesus, and now through us. Because God is gracious and willing to forgive everything, the only sin that he cannot forgive is the sin that causes a person to refuse to repent, right? Pride. That's what a lot of theologians will say, that the only true sin is pride, that pride is just the source of all sin. All sins are just a form of that. But the reality is, pride is a failure to recognize one's actual worth, one's true rank, one's true position in the grand scale of the universe. Us versus God. Pride says we're on equal terms, that God owes us something. He owes us an explanation. But he doesn't, because he's God and he is above us. Job's story shows us our position in regards to God, that we do not share his level of wisdom. We do not share his position of authority. We do not share his worth. We do not share anything that is not given to us by him through Jesus. We cannot be owed anything by God, but yet he gives graciously. And so when we look at the story of Israel, and then when we look at our own lives, and we look at the suffering and the pain and the hardship and the things that don't make sense from our perspective, and we go, God, why? You may not get the answer. You may not get any answer. It may not make sense, but the reality of it is the world is broken. He does not rejoice in pain and suffering. He hates it. He hates when his people suffer. But the way things are is the best version. And so when we look at our lives and we look at what God is doing, what he's done through Christ and what he's building, it's like we're standing over that construction site there on that hill in southeast Ohio, overlooking these poured foundations, these earthworks that have begun. And we can recognize the project that God is doing. It's not done yet. And we look at it, we marvel at what's going to be, we celebrate it, and we grab a shovel and a hard hat. I hope this helps you understand Romans a little bit better. If you have any questions, reach out. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.